Well, let's talk about your story, how you decided to get involved in the business. Was there like a moment where you said, "How do I get into wrestling? How do I figure out a way in the door through the industry?"
The answer to that is I never did. I
Hmm.
was always a huge fan, a huge wrestling magazine collector, a book reader, a tape trader when the VHS era started, you know?
Hmm.
And one day I'm at my job. I had just moved to the New York City area. I was working for a magazine called Pro Sound News. I've always been a journalist and writer. And I was working for a magazine that specialized in writing about guitar cables, new keyboards, stuff like that, professional sound reinforcement, that kind of stuff. Kind of dry, but it was fun. But then I'm reading the New York Times, and if you can believe it, there were like 5 pages of editorial jobs in the New York Times back then. And this is how I got my job because I had come from upstate. By the way, I should say that my early job, I was a sports editor for a small town paper called the Catskill Daily Mail, and I also worked for the Hudson Register Star in upstate New York. And I did win a couple of journalism awards, so that didn't hurt. I actually won an article, major journalism award for an interview I did with Mike Tyson when he had just turned 20 years old. And that's unbelievable resume fodder,
Yeah,
especially he was one of the biggest sports stars in the world at that point. So
unbelievable.
I'm sitting around home on a Sunday and I see this ad in the Sunday New York Times. It says 2 lines: editor slash writer wanted for sports entertainment pub. And I went, holy smoke, sports entertainment, that's wrestling. And the second line said, send clips and resume to box blah 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 RVC New York. I said RVC Rockville Center. That's the publisher of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. Because you read the little text box in the beginning of every
Hmm.
magazine. So I sent in my Tyson clips. I sent in the best stuff I had. I had a phone call on a Tuesday. Was hired by Friday, and I lasted there for about 7 or 8 years after that. I went. It was my first national magazine exposure and experience. I I thought I walked in and knew as much about wrestling as anybody who worked there, and then I proved myself that I did. I got to work with Bill Apter and Craig Peters and Stu Sachs and Andy Rodriguez and Dave Rosenbaum, Roy London and Ken Morgan, the great art director, and incredible staff. We would churn out so much stuff, and I thought it was entertaining and fun and good. And 35 years later, people still say, "Do you remember when you wrote this?" And I say, "No." "Okay, I'll send you a clip." And they send me a PDF of the stuff I had done way back then. The gratifying thing is people still remember those days like crazy. And I'm convinced that if they didn't remember, I wouldn't have a podcast now. Nobody would want to hear what I have to say. But they remember. I'm shocked, man. I just, it's phenomenal to me how loyal wrestling fans are, even to the magazines. It's incredible.
I remember the first time I ever started reading wrestling magazines, and that's to me the most exciting part when I started reading and flipping through is the articles that talked about, this wrestler's like on the rise. You think of guys like Kurt Angle or Eddie Guerrero, reading their, rise to fame and glory, especially like when you hear about, somebody like a Kurt Angle, making their way into the company and, it's maybe they're 6 months in and they talk about, this guy's going to be the next champion and hearing about it. And I'm just like, wow, this is pretty amazing. So with you, can you tell me like of any stories that you enjoyed writing during your time with PWI?
Absolutely, and you just hit the nail on the head for me because one of the things I was tasked with doing for the Wrestler magazine, it wasn't just PWI, it was the Wrestler, Inside Wrestling, Sports Review Wrestling, Wrestling
Hmm.
Superstars. We had eight
All
or
of them.
nine titles. It was crazy. But I used to write the introducing features in every issue of the Wrestler for about 4 or 5 years, and I can say pretty pretty assuredly that I gave the first national publicity to Cactus Jack, Sid Vicious, Rob Van Dam. On the list went lots of people. I'd have to have a stack of books just to see which ones really took off. But there are so many people that because I used to in my free time I had free reign to go to any indie cards I wanted to see, and a lot of these guys were working indies. I had made a trip to Memphis, and I saw Rob Van Dam before he was Rob Van Dam. He's known as Rob Stakowski, right? And it was
Hmm.
one of the best opening matches ever saw. He wrestled Nightmare Danny Davis in Memphis, and I came back and said, I got to cover this guy. So I had a kind of free reign to introduce these young kids to the wrestling world. Some of them made it, some of them didn't. But you know what? I'm really happy with that. And my work on the PWI 500, I wrote the first two, right, in 1991 and 1992. I didn't write all. I didn't make the ratings for the top tens back then. I think the staff did those, but I did the whole rest of it and wrote up all the little bios. And the impact that the PWI 500 has had to this day, I can't even understress it. It's astounding to me how serious people take that thing, and I think they still do now.